I was told you need a husband. That's what the mountain man said when he knocked on the lonely widow's door. Snow was falling hard, the fire near gone, and she'd been fighting to hold her land since the day her man was buried. He was a stranger, broad-shouldered, quiet, and carrying secrets the wind itself couldn't pry loose. But behind him rode trouble, a land agent with railroad gold in his pocket, and a deputy willing to take more than the law allowed. He offered her protection, but at a price she never thought she'd pay. And in these mountains, marriage papers can mean the difference between keeping your home or watching it stolen plank by plank. Yet the winter wasn't the only danger. There were charges whispered against the man she'd just bound herself to, and the law was coming fast. Before we dive in, drop your name or city in the comments. It reminds me that behind every view is a real heartbeat. Through the frost-etched window, Hannah watched the stranger's broad back disappear into the swirling snow, heading toward her barn. The lantern he carried cast dancing shadows across the white ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed her forehead to the cold glass, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was told you need a husband. His words echoed in her mind, direct and unsettling as a summer storm. Hannah wrapped her shawl tighter, moving away from the window to stoke the dying fire. The flames caught the fresh wood, crackling and sending a burst of warmth through the small cabin. She hadn't invited many visitors since Thomas died in the mine collapse 2 years ago. The homestead had grown quiet, save for the wind in the pines and the occasional cry of a mountain lion. But tonight, a stranger named Jonas Hollis had appeared like a spirit from the storm, bearing supplies and an impossible proposition. Hannah's hands trembled as she picked up her husband's picture from the mantel. Thomas smiled back at her, forever. Young in the faded photograph. What would you make of this? She whispered, running her thumb across the frame's smooth wood. The answer that came to her was clear as spring water. Thomas would want her safe, wanted her to keep the homestead. They'd built together. From the barn came the sound of hammering. Hannah returned to the window, peering through the thickening snow. The lantern light showed Jonas working at the barn door, fixing the broken latch she'd been meaning to repair for weeks. His movements were sure and steady, even in the bitter cold. She thought back to his explanation that Thomas's old army friend, Captain Matthews, had written to him about her situation. The railroad men had been sniffing around her land lately, making offers that sounded more like threats. A woman alone had few protections out here in the Colorado Highlands. The hammering stopped. Through the snow-filled dark, she watched Jonas lead his mule into the barn. The beast's saddlebags had been heavy with supplies, flour, coffee, salt pork, and other provisions that made her realize how bare her own pantry had grown. Hannah moved to her small kitchen table, sinking into a chair. The stale bread she'd been about to eat for supper lay forgotten. Her mother's words came back to her. The Lord works in mysterious ways, child. Was this God's answer to her prayers for help? Or was Jonas Hollis just another threat dressed up as salvation? She studied her rough hands in the lamplight, remembering how they'd ached from splitting kindling earlier. The winter ahead looked long and lean. Even if she didn't need a husband, she surely needed help to keep the homestead going. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. In the barn, Jonas would be bedding down in the hay, probably wrapped in the thick bear fur coat he'd worn. Hannah had noticed how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he spoke, how his voice carried a gentle rumble like distant thunder. He moved with the careful grace of a man accustomed to hard work and wild places. Rising from the table, Hannah went through her nighttime routine with mechanical precision, banking the fire, checking the locks, saying her prayers. But her thoughts kept drifting to the stranger in her barn. Captain Matthews had been one of Thomas's most trusted friends. If he'd sent Jonas Hollis, there must have been good reason. She blew out the lamp and climbed into her cold bed, pulling the quilts up to boost her chin. The darkness pressed close, but somehow it felt different tonight. The crushing loneliness that usually descended with nightfall seemed held at bay by the knowledge that someone else was near, someone who might understand the weight she carried. Through the wall, she could hear the wind's mournful song. Snow continued to fall, adding another white blanket to the sleeping land. In the barn, a mule nickered softly. Hannah closed her eyes, remembering Jonas's simple words at her door. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, her dreams were filled with the scent of pine and snow, and the possibility of tomorrow. The broken barn latch was only the first thing Jonas had fixed that night, though Hannah wouldn't realize it until much later. That simple act of repair had already begun mending something else. The frayed edges of hope she'd thought were lost forever in the lonely months since Thomas died. Outside, the Colorado winter raged on, but inside Hannah's heart, a tiny spark had been lit. Whether it would grow into a flame remained to be seen, but for now, she let herself rest in the strange comfort of knowing she wasn't completely alone anymore. The night deepened, wrapping the homestead in its quiet embrace. In the barn, Jonas stretched out in the hay, his thoughts turning to the widow whose land he'd promised to protect. In the house, Hannah drifted between sleep and waking, wondering what morning would bring. Between them, the snow continued to fall, covering everything in a clean white blanket that promised a fresh start. The first pale light of dawn crept over the snow-covered hills, painting the world in shades of pearl and silver. Hannah pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped onto her front porch, the warm planks creaking beneath her feet. The sight that greeted her made her pause mid-step. Jonas Hawley stood at her woodpile, his broad shoulders rising and falling in a steady rhythm as he split logs with practiced strokes. Steam rose from his back in the frigid morning air, his bare fur coat draped over a nearby fence post. The pile of neatly stacked wood grew with each swing of the axe. He looked up as the door creaked, nodding once before returning to his work. No good morning, no small talk. Just a solid thunk of axe meeting wood. Hannah found herself oddly grateful for his silence. It gave her space to think. The kitchen felt warmer than usual as she stirred the cornmeal into boiling water. The familiar motions helped settle her mind, still uneasy with having a stranger so close. When Jonas finally came in, stamping snow from his boots, the mush was ready and coffee bubbled in the pot. "Much obliged," he said quietly, accepting the steaming cup she offered. His hands, rough with calluses, dwarfed the tin mug. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the pop of burning wood in the stove. Finally, Jonas cleared his throat. "About what I said last night." He set his spoon down carefully. "Captain Matthews wrote me a letter. Asked me to look after you. Said you might need help holding onto your claim." Hannah's spine stiffened. "I managed fine on my own. Didn't mean to suggest otherwise." Jonas pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, sliding it across the table. "But there's things you should know about. Man named Preston's been buying up widow claims all through these parts. Some say he doesn't always play fair." Hannah's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter. She recognized Captain Matthews' precise handwriting, describing how Preston had been seen in town asking questions about her homestead. The captain's concern was clear in every line. When Matthews wrote "look after," I took it to mean ... Jonas paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, I reckon I jumped to conclusions about marriage. That wasn't right of me." "No," Hannah agreed. But some of the sharpness had left her voice. She'd heard whispers about Preston, though she'd never met the man himself. The thought of losing her land, her last connection to Thomas, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter morning. Outside, the storm had settled into a steady fall of fat, lazy flakes. Jonas finished his breakfast and stood, reaching for his coat. Your porch rail's about to give way. Best fix it before more snow piles up. Hannah watched through the window as he worked, his movements economical and sure. The broken rail had worried her for weeks, but she hadn't had the strength to repair it properly. Jonas made quick work of it, even finding time to reinforce the other posts. When the storm lightened in the afternoon, they walked to the barn together to check on his mule. The animal greeted Jonas with a soft whicker, pushing its nose against his chest. "Easy there, old girl," he murmured, stroking its neck. Hannah noticed how his voice changed when he spoke to the beast, gentle, almost tender. It reminded her of how Thomas used to talk to their old Mari. The rest of the day passed in a rhythm of necessary tasks. Jonas split more wood while Hannah tended to her few winter chickens and worked on mending a torn quilt. As darkness fell, she found herself adding extra vegetables to her usual stew, enough for 2 portions. Over supper, Jonas spoke more than he had all day, sharing tales of trapping in the high country. His quiet voice painted pictures of snow-laden pines and starlit peaks, of elk tracks in virgin snow, and the silence of mountain meadows. Hannah found herself leaning forward, drawn into his descriptions of a world she'd never seen. When the dishes were done, Jonas brought in his bedroll from the barn. "If you don't mind," he said, nodding toward the hearth. "Barn's a mite cold, and I sleep better knowing the house is secure." Hannah hesitated only a moment before nodding. She'd seen enough that day to know he was a man of his word. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom later, the sound of someone else moving about the house below felt strange, but not unwelcome. It had been so long since she'd heard anything but the wind in the night. Lying in bed, Hannah could hear Jonas adding wood to the fire, the solid thunk of each log hitting the grate. The familiar crackle of flames mixed with the soft sounds of another human presence. The whisper of fabric as he settled into his bedroll. The quiet rhythm of breathing. She thought of Preston and his land schemes, of Captain Matthew's warning letter. Then she thought of her repaired porch rail, the stacked woodpile, and the gentle way Jonas spoke to his mule. Sleep came easier than she expected, wrapped in the strange comfort of not being alone. That morning brought stillness to the highlands. The storm's fury spent at last. Fresh snow blanketed everything in pristine white, transforming familiar shapes into mysterious humps and drifts. Hannah stood at her kitchen window, watching steam rise from her coffee cup as she assessed the work ahead. The chicken coop would need checking. Her small flock depended on her, and the heavy snow might have damaged their shelter. She pulled on her husband's old boots, the leather still stiff despite the years of wear. As she stepped onto the porch, she found Jonas already outside, shovel in hand, methodically clearing a path through knee-deep snow. "Thought you might need to check those chickens," he said without looking up, his breath clouding in the crisp air. The morning sun caught the silver threading through his dark hair. "Much obliged," Hannah replied, following the path he created. The snow had drifted high against the coop's western wall, but the roof seemed to have held. Jonas worked steadily beside her, clearing space around the small building while she scattered feed for her nervous birds. The crunch of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. 2 riders approached through the snow, one lean and citified, in a fine wool coat and bowler hat, the other heavy-set in a deputy's badge and weather-worn duster. Hannah recognized Samuel Finch from his occasional appearances in town, though he'd never before graced her property with his presence. Jonas straightened, letting his shovel rest against the coop. He kept his stance casual, but Hannah noticed how he positioned himself slightly between her and the newcomers. "Mrs. Cole," Finch called out, his voice carrying clearly in the winter air. He removed his bowler with theatrical politeness. "I trust you're keeping warm this fine morning?" Deputy Rourke remained mounted, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene, particularly Jonas's presence. His horse shifted restlessly beneath him, hooves pawing at the snow. "State your business, Mr. Finch," Hannah said, drawing her shawl tighter. The morning's peaceful mood had shattered like thin ice. Finch's smile never wavered as he extracted a folded paper from his breast pocket. "Merely a matter of paperwork, my dear lady. It seems there are some irregularities in your property deed." He extended the document toward her. "The railroad company has expressed interest in this parcel, given its proximity to the proposed route. They've asked me to investigate all claims in the area." Hannah's fingers trembled slightly as she took the paper, but her voice remained steady. "My husband filed everything proper and legal 5 years ago." "Ah, yes, the late Mr. Cole." Finch's sympathetic tone rang false as a brass penny. "Unfortunately, there appear to be some questions about the timing of certain filings. Technical matters, you understand. The railroad's lawyers are quite particular about these things." Jonas moved closer, his shadow falling across the document. In Hannah's hands. "Mind if I take a look at that?" he asked quietly. When Hannah nodded, he studied the paper carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. "I've seen this type of claim before," he said finally, folding the paper with deliberate precision. "Back when I scouted for the Army, certain parties tried similar tricks with homestead deeds near the new fort." Finch's smile tightened. "I assure you, everything is quite legal. Deputy Rourke here can verify that you're acting as an agent of the railroad." Jonas interrupted mildly. "I reckon he could. Might also verify how many other widows have had their deeds questioned lately." Deputy Rourke shifted in his saddle, one hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. "Best watch your tone, stranger. This here's official business." "Seems mighty unofficial to me," Jonas replied, his calm voice carrying an edge of steel. "Especially since the circuit judge won't be through for another 2 months to hear any real challenges." Finch's facade of politeness cracked slightly. "The railroad doesn't like delays, Mr. Hawley, Jonas Hawley." He handed the paper back to Hannah. "And the only way to file a counterclaim before the judge's arrival would be through a legal husband's right of property." His words fell into the winter silence like stones into deep water. Hannah felt her breath catch. The truth of it hit her hard, without a husband's name on the deed. Her claim stood vulnerable to any official-looking challenge. Thomas had warned her about such things, but they both thought they had more time. Indeed. Finch's smile returned, sharper now. "Something to consider, Mrs. Cole. The railroad's offer is quite generous, for now." He replaced his bowler with a flourish. "We'll call again soon to discuss terms." He turned his horse, Deputy Rourke following after a final warning glance. Hannah watched until they disappeared beyond the snow-covered rise, her husband's Bible verses about trusting in providence ringing hollow in her memory. The morning's peace lay shattered around her like broken glass. That evening, after a supper neither of them really tasted, Hannah sat at her kitchen table with Thomas's old Bible before her. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, its pages marked with notes in her late husband's careful hand. The lamp's flame cast wavering shadows as she traced his familiar writing, remembering how he'd read aloud each night. Across the room, Jonas sat in Thomas's old chair, the steady rasp of whetstone against steel marking his progress as he sharpened his knife. He hadn't mentioned marriage again, hadn't pressed her about Finch's threat. His silence felt like respect rather than indifference, giving her space to wrestle with her pride and fear. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters Thomas had hung 5 summers ago. Hannah's fingers found the passage he'd marked about faith being the substance of things hoped for. But faith wouldn't stop Finch from taking her land, wouldn't protect the home she and Thomas had built from nothing but dreams and hard work. The lamplight flickered as a stronger gust shook the cabin. Hannah looked up from the Bible to find Jonas. watching her, his hand still on the whetstone. In his eyes she saw understanding, patience, and something else, a steadiness that reminded her of mountain peaks against the sky. He didn't speak, didn't try to sway her choice. Just returned to his task, letting her sit with her thoughts and the whisper of wind through the eaves. The morning dawned brittle and clear, the sun glinting off snow-crusted branches like scattered diamonds. Hannah pulled her woolen shawl tighter. As she made her way to the barn, her boots crunching through the fresh powder. Inside, old Molly nickered a greeting, her breath visible in the cold air. "We're heading to town today, girl," Hannah murmured, running a gloved hand along the Mare's neck. The leather harness felt stiff as she worked it over Molly's head, her fingers clumsy with cold despite her mittens. The barn door creaked, and Jonas stepped in, leading his mule. "Mind if I ride along?" he asked, already reaching for his saddle. Winter makes the road treacherous, especially near Miller's Creek crossing. Hannah hesitated, then nodded. Having him along made sense, even if it would set tongues wagging in town. "I need to see Reverend Avery," she said, keeping her voice neutral, "and pick up some coffee beans." They set out as the sun climbed higher, following the snow-packed trail that wound through stands of pine and bare-branched aspen. Their mounts' hooves broke through the crusty surface with each step, making progress slow but steady. The creek beds they passed were frozen solid, ice gleaming between snow-covered banks. After a while, Jonas cleared his throat. "My sister Martha lost her claim 3 years back," he said quietly, his words hanging in the still air. "Similar situation. Railroad men with fancy papers and smooth talk." He adjusted his hat, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "By the time we learned it wasn't legal, they'd already run track through her garden plot." Hannah glanced at him, seeing the old anger in the set of his jaw. "What happened to her?" "Moved in with our cousin in Kansas Territory." His mouth twisted. "Lost everything she built over 5 years of working that land. Since then, I've had little trust for men who wave papers and talk about progress." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds their mounts breathing and the creak of leather. The town came into view around midday, smoke rising straight up from chimney stacks in the clear air. Hannah felt eyes on them as they tied their animals outside the general store. Inside, warmth from the pot-bellied stove hit them like a wave. Mrs. Rathbone stood behind the counter, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of their arrival. While Jonas browsed the tool section, Hannah selected her coffee beans. My, Mrs. Rathbone said, loud enough to carry to the other customers. "That mountain man's been staying out at your place, hasn't he, Hannah Cole? Quite the talk of the valley, him courting a widow in winter." Hannah kept her face carefully blank as she counted out coins. "Mr. Holly has been helping with repairs," she said evenly. Nothing more to talk about than that. But she could feel the weight of stares as she and Jonas left the store, could practically hear the whispers starting up behind them. The walk to the church seemed longer than usual, though it was just down the street. They found Reverend Avery in his study, a small room heated by a modest fire. The preacher's weathered face creased with concern as Hannah explained about Finch's visit and the questionable deed challenge. "It's not the first such case I've heard," he said, stroking his graying beard. "The railroad's been pushing hard to secure right-of-way through the valley." He looked between Hannah and Jonas, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're here to ask about marriage laws, aren't you?" Hannah nodded, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "Is it ... would it be legal to marry for protecting the land?" The Reverend leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Under Homestead law, a legal marriage would indeed secure your claim more firmly. It's not uncommon in frontier territories. Practical partnerships for mutual benefit." He paused, studying them both. "Unconventional, perhaps, but not unlawful." The important question is whether both parties enter into it with clear understanding and honest intent. Jonas shifted in his seat but remained silent, letting Hannah ask her questions. The Reverend answered each one patiently, explaining the legal protections marriage would provide and the responsibilities it would entail. When they finally stepped back out into the winter afternoon, Hannah felt both clearer and more uncertain than before. The law might allow it, but her heart still wrestled with the idea of a marriage built on necessity rather than love. The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as the sun began its early winter descent. The snow had taken on a blue cast in the fading light, and their shadows stretched long across its pristine surface. They were nearly home when Jonas finally spoke. "Whatever you decide," he said softly, "I'll respect it. But I meant what I said about helping you keep your land. That's a promise I aim to keep, one way or another." Hannah nodded, unable to find words past the tightness in her throat. Together, they rode the last stretch home in silence, while the setting sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. After their meeting with Reverend Avery, Hannah and Jonas lingered in the church's small vestibule. The afternoon light filtered through frosted windows, casting long shadows across the warm floorboards. Hannah twisted her hands in her shawl, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we're to do this, it should be today, before I lose my nerve." Jonas nodded, his expression solemn. "I'll fetch Mrs. Rathbone for witness, if you'd like to change into something more fitting." The general store owner's wife arrived quickly, clearly delighted to be part of such unexpected proceedings. She helped Hannah smooth her best calico, dressed pale blue with tiny white flowers, save for Sundays and special occasions. The fabric felt stiff from disuse, but at least it was clean and proper. Through the church's small side window, Hannah watched Jonas return from his mule's saddlebags wearing a freshly brushed flannel shirt, dark brown and free of patches. He'd even attempted to tame his windswept hair, though stubborn strands still curled at his collar. Reverend Avery arranged them before the simple wooden altar. Late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, warming the bare walls of the clapboard church. Mrs. Rathbone sat in the front pew, practically vibrating with the excitement of being the sole witness to such news. The ceremony was brief and practical, like everything else about their arrangement. Hannah's fingers trembled slightly as Jonas slipped a plain brass ring onto her finger. He'd bought it at the general store while she was changing, she realized. His large hands were gentle, careful, not to crush her smaller ones. "Do you, Jonas Hawley, take Hannah Cole to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Avery's deep voice filled the small space. "I do." Jonas's words were quiet but firm. "And do you, Hannah Cole, take Jonas Hawley to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Hannah swallowed hard. "I do." The words felt strange in her mouth, like speaking in a dream. But they were said, and true, and legally binding. That was what mattered. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Avery declared. "You may kiss the bride." Jonas hesitated, then leaned down to press the briefest, most chaste of kisses to Hannah's cheek. His beard tickled her skin, and she caught a whiff of pine and leather, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. They signed the church registry next, their names flowing one after the other in black ink. Jonas Hawley, Hannah Cole Hawley. The sight of her new name made her breath catch. Mrs. Rathbone added her flourishing signature as witness, beaming with satisfaction. "Well then," Jonas said, as they stepped out into the cold afternoon air, "best head home before dark." The ride back was quiet, their mounts picking their way carefully through the snowy track. Jonas kept his mule close to Hannah's mare, ready to assist if either animal stumbled in the deepening shadows. The sun sank behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of purple and rose. Hannah's mind whirled with the day's events. That morning, she'd been a widow living alone. Now she was a married woman again, though to a virtual stranger. Her fingers kept brushing against the unfamiliar weight of the ring. They reached the cabin just as true darkness settled in. Jonas took care of both animals, while Hannah lit the lamps and stoked the fire. The familiar tasks helped steady her nerves. Supper was simple, the last of yesterday's biscuits warmed by the fire, and a pot of beans she'd left simmering that morning. They ate in companionable silence, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound besides the crackling hearth. When the dishes were done, Hannah cleared her throat. "The loft is yours, if you'd like. I'll keep my room." She paused, then added, "I know this is a marriage of convenience, but I'd prefer if we took time to know each other proper." "Of course," Jonas agreed immediately. "Wouldn't be right otherwise." He gathered his bedroll and saddlebags, climbing the ladder to the loft with careful movements that spoke of consideration for her peace of mind. Hannah retreated to her small bedroom, changing into her nightdress behind the closed door. The familiar quilt welcomed her, but sleep proved elusive. Above, she could hear the soft sounds of Jonas settling in boots being removed, the rustle of blankets, the creak of floorboards as he found a comfortable position. She lay awake, listening to those small movements, marveling at how quickly life could change. Yesterday, she'd been alone with her fears about losing the land. Now she had a husband, a stranger still, but one who seemed honorable in his intentions to help protect her claim. The steady rhythm of Jonas's breathing eventually evened out into the deep pattern of sleep. Hannah stared into the darkness, her new ring cool against her finger, wondering what tomorrow would bring. So much had changed, yet everything still felt uncertain, balanced on the edge of something she couldn't quite name. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's frost-covered windows. Jonas's footsteps creaked softly overhead as he descended the loft ladder. Hannah lay still in her bed, listening as he moved quietly through the main room, trying not to wake her. The front door opened and closed with a gentle thud. Through her window, she watched his broad figure trudge through the snow toward the barn. A few minutes later, he emerged with a long wooden ladder propped against his shoulder. The morning air was crisp and still as he carefully positioned the ladder against the cabin's edge. Hannah rose and dressed quickly, stoking the banked fire and setting coffee to boil. The familiar routine felt different now, knowing someone else would share the morning meal. She mixed a batch of flapjack batter, adding a pinch of cinnamon she'd been saving for special occasions. The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air along with Jonas. Snow dusted his shoulders and beard. "Roof's holding fine," he reported, stamping his boots clean. "But we should clear some off before the next storm hits." "Coffee's nearly ready," Hannah replied, pouring batter onto the hot griddle. "And flapjacks won't be long after." Jonas hung his coat by the door and moved to warm his hands by the stove. The domestic silence between them felt less awkward than the day before, settling into something almost comfortable. Soon they sat across from each other at the small table, steam rising from their coffee cups. Jonas drizzled molasses over his flapjacks with careful precision, as if rationing each precious drop. Hannah found herself studying his hands, large and weathered, yet gentle in their movements. "These are mighty fine," Jonas said after his first bite. "Been a while since I had proper flapjacks." "Thank you," Hannah replied, pleased despite herself. "Though we'll need to be careful with the flour. It's got to last till spring." Jonas nodded. "I'll head down to the creek today, bring up more water while the weather's clear." And so their day began, falling into an unspoken rhythm. After breakfast, Jonas took the wooden yoke and buckets to the creek while Hannah gathered eggs from the chicken coop. When he returned, she settled by the fire with his spare shirts, mending tears and reinforcing worn seams with neat, even stitches. The afternoon light was starting to fade when Jonas came in from the barn, carrying what looked like crude wooden frames with leather straps. "Thought you might could use these," he said, holding them out. "Snowshoes. Make it easier to reach the creek when the drifts are deep." Hannah set aside her mending and took one of the frames, running her fingers along the roughly woven rawhide webbing. "I've never used such things before." "Not hard once you get the hang of it," Jonas assured her. "Best try them now while there's still light." They stepped outside, where Jonas showed her how to strap the snowshoes to her boots. "Walk like you're trying to step over a fence," he demonstrated, taking exaggerated steps. "Keep your feet apart so the shoes don't tangle." Hannah's first attempts were wobbly, her feet feeling enormous and unwieldy. She took a few tentative steps, arms outstretched for balance. Jonas walked backward in front of her, ready to catch her if needed. "That's it," he encouraged. "Just like that." She was starting to feel more confident when her left foot caught on her right snowshoe. Hannah pitched forward with a startled cry, landing face first in a deep drift. For a moment she lay there, snow seeping into her collar. Then she heard a deep, rich chuckle from Jonas. The sound surprised her so much that she started laughing too, the noise echoing across the snow-covered yard. Jonas reached down to help her up, his eyes crinkling at the corners with amusement. "Reckon that's enough practice for one day," he said, brushing snow from her coat. "You'll get better with time." Back inside, they warmed themselves by the fire. Hannah mixed up a batch of cornbread while Jonas cleaned his rifle at the table. The familiar tasks filled the cabin with comfortable sounds: scrape of the cleaning rod, the clatter of the cast iron pan, the pop and crackle of the fire dot as Hannah placed the hot cornbread on the table. Jonas's eyes drifted to the mantel, where her late husband's Bible sat, its leather cover worn smooth with age. She noticed his gaze and touched the book's spine gently. "Haven't opened it much since Thomas died," she admitted quietly. "Used to read it every night, but now ... She trailed off, unable to explain how the familiar words had become painful reminders of her lost. Jonas was silent for a long moment, his hand still on his rifle. "Been a while for me too," he finally said, his voice low. "Not since the Apache campaign." He set the cleaning rod down carefully. "Saw things there ... did things. Made it hard to believe in much of anything after." Hannah studied his face, in the firelight, seeing the shadow of old pain in his eyes. She didn't press for details, but something in her chest eased slightly at this shared confession of doubt. They ate their cornbread in thoughtful silence, each lost in their own memories. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls as darkness gathered outside. Snow began falling again, soft flakes drifting past the windows, but the cabin felt warmer somehow, more like a home than it had in many months. Jonas moved forward cautiously, one hand resting on his belt knife. Hannah followed, her heart beating faster. They rounded a massive fallen pine, its roots thrust skyward like grasping fingers. There, wedged in the hollow beneath the trunk, lay a small figure. A boy, no more than 10 years old, huddled in threadbare clothes. His dark eyes watched them warily from a face pinched with cold and hunger. Even shivering, he held himself still as a frightened rabbit. A week had passed since the snowshoe lesson. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Hannah and Jonas set out to check his trapline. Jonas had established it 3 days ago, hoping to supplement their dwindling winter stores with rabbit meat. Hannah insisted on coming along, wanting to learn the trail markers for herself. They trudged through knee-deep snow, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Jonas pointed out subtle signs as they walked, a broken branch here, a notched tree there. Hannah listened carefully, knowing such knowledge could mean survival in these mountains. "Stop," Jonas said suddenly, his voice low. He held up one hand, head tilted. "You hear that?" Hannah strained her ears. At first, she heard only the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Then, a faint sound, like someone trying to stifle a cough. Jonas slowly crouched down, keeping his movements gentle. "Hello there," he said softly. The boy pressed further back, into his shelter. Hannah noticed his moccasins and the traditional woven patterns on his worn jacket. Navajo work, she realized. "You speak English?" Jonas asked. The boy gave a tiny nod but said nothing. Jonas reached into his coat, moving deliberately. He pulled out a strip of jerky, holding it out. "Hungry? Hungry?" The boy's eyes fixed on the food, but he didn't move. Hannah understood his hesitation. She unwound her wool shawl and held it out alongside the jerky. "You must be cold," she said. "Please, take it." Something in her voice seemed to reach him. Slowly the boy emerged from his shelter. He accepted both offerings with trembling hands, wrapping the shawl around his shoulders. The jerky disappeared in 3 desperate bites. "I'm Jonas," Jonas said. "This here's Hannah. What's your name?" The boy swallowed hard. "Toma," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "You're a long way from Navajo country, Toma," Jonas observed quietly. "How do you come to be out here?" Toma's face clouded. He made a series of gestures, pointing down the trail, mimicking the motion of wagon wheels, then a shoving motion. His meaning was clear enough. He'd been with a freight wagon, crew who'd abandoned him. Hannah felt anger kindle in her chest. What kind of men would leave a child alone in winter mountains? She exchanged a look with Jonas, seeing the same fury in his eyes. "Come on," Jonas said, standing. "Our cabin's not far. You need proper food and warmth." Toma hesitated, glancing between them. Hannah held out her hand. "Please," she said, "let us help." After a long moment, Toma took her hand. His fingers were ice-cold against her palm. Jonas led the way back, breaking trail through the deepest drifts. Hannah kept her pace slow, supporting Toma when he stumbled on weakened legs. Back at the cabin, Hannah immediately set about heating bone broth while Jonas helped Toma out of his frozen clothes. The boy was thin as a winter sparrow beneath his layers. Jonas wrapped him in a spare blanket and settled him close to the fire. Toma accepted the mug of broth with shaking hands, sipping carefully. Color slowly returned to his cheeks as warmth and nourishment worked their way through him. Hannah brought cornbread next, watching as he tried to eat slowly despite his obvious hunger. No words were needed when Hannah caught Jonas's eye. They both knew Toma would stay, at least until spring. Made travel safer. The thought of sending him away never even crossed their minds. As evening settled in, Toma grew heavy-lidded with exhaustion. Hannah made him a pallet near the hearth, piling it with quilts. He curled up like a young fox in its den, watching them through half-closed eyes. Hannah took up her darning by lamplight, working on the pile of socks that needed mending. Jonas sat in his usual chair, whittling a piece of pine. The familiar rasp of his knife against wood filled the quiet room. Toma's breathing eventually deepened into sleep. Hannah paused in her work, studying his peaceful face. "Poor child," she murmured. "What he must have been through." Jonas nodded, his hands stilling on his carving. "Freight crews can be a rough lot," he said quietly. "But to abandon a boy... double quotes, he shook his head, jaw tightening. "We'll need to make him warmer clothes," Hannah said, already mentally cataloging what could be altered to fit him, "and teach him English properly." "Aye," Jonas agreed. "And come spring... He trailed off, both of them knowing the challenges that lay ahead. Finding Toma's people would not be simple, if it was even possible, but that was a worry for another day. For now, they had a child to care for, and that was enough. Hannah returned to her darning, Jonas to his whittling. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light over their unlikely family circle. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their small homestead in pristine white. Inside, three souls who had been alone found themselves somehow less lonely, brought together by circumstance and choice. The cabin felt different, now fuller, warmer, more alive with possibility. Days settled into a comfortable rhythm at the Cole homestead. The morning sun painted long shadows across fresh snow as Jonas showed Toma how to stack firewood against the cabin wall. His large hands guided the boy's smaller ones, demonstrating how to lay each piece so the pile wouldn't topple. Like building a fence, Jonas explained, placing another log. Each piece needs to support the others. Toma nodded, his dark eyes intent on the task. He picked up more English words each day, though he still spoke sparingly. The boy lifted another piece of wood, carefully matching Jonas's pattern. "That's right," Jonas praised. "You're getting mighty good at this." From the doorway, Hannah watched them work together. Something warm bloomed in her chest at the sight. Jonas had a gentle way with the boy that belied his imposing size. She'd noticed it more and more these past days, how he always made sure Toma had enough to eat, how he'd carved a small wooden horse for the boy to play with. "Time to gather eggs," Hannah called out. Toma looked up eagerly. She'd discovered he had a way with animals. The normally skittish hens barely ruffled their feathers when he approached Dot in the coop. Hannah demonstrated how to reach under each hen with slow, careful movements. "Let them know you're there," she explained. "No sudden moves to startle them." Toma copied her actions perfectly, collecting 3 brown eggs in his small hands. A smile lit his face as he held them up for her approval, one of his rare, true smiles that made his whole being shine. Hannah couldn't help smiling back. Later that morning, they hitched up the wagon to fetch hay from the neighboring Carson ranch. The old mare, Molly, plodded steadily through the snow while Jonas's mule followed behind. Toma rode in the wagon bed, wrapped in a wool blanket against the cold. The return journey was slow going, the wagon heavy with fresh hay. Hannah sat close to Jonas on the wagon seat, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Once, when the wheel hit a rut, she grabbed his arm to steady herself. His skin felt warm even through his coat sleeve. Hannah caught Jonas watching her then, his eyes soft in a way she'd never seen before. Something flickered in their depths that made her breath catch and her heart beat faster. She looked away quickly, her cheeks warming despite the winter air. That evening, Hannah made a hearty supper of beans and cornbread, the kitchen filled with warmth from the cook stove and the quiet sounds of their meal. Toma's head began to droop over his half-finished plate, exhaustion from the day's work finally catching up to him. Jonas rose without a word. With gentle hands, he lifted the sleeping boy from his chair. Toma barely stirred as Jonas carried him to his pallet by the hearth, tucking the quilts around him with careful movements. Hannah's hands stilled on the dishes she was clearing. She watched Jonas smooth Toma's dark hair back from his forehead, such a fatherly gesture it made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. As she wiped down the table, Hannah's eyes fell on Jonas's latest woodworking project in the corner. He'd been carving in the evenings, his skilled hands shaping pine wood into the graceful curves of a cradle. When she'd first noticed it, he'd simply said it was just in case. But the care he took with each detail spoke of deeper hopes. Hannah ran her fingers along the smooth edge of the half-finished cradle. The wood was warm to her touch, lovingly worked. She thought of how Jonas had come to her door that snowy night, speaking of marriage as mere convenience. Yet now, there were these moments, his gentle hands with Toma, his quiet way of anticipating her needs, the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. The cradle seemed to whisper of dreams beyond mere survival, of a true family taking shape within these walls. Jonas came up beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I reckon it'll need a coat of paint when it's done," he said softly. maybe blue. Hannah's heart quickened at the future woven into those simple words. She looked up at him, finding that same soft look in his eyes. This time, she didn't look away. Blue would be nice, she whispered. They stood there in the lamplight, the sleeping boy's gentle breathing and the crackle of the fire, the only sounds in their quiet cabin. The evening settled around them like a warm blanket, full of unspoken possibilities and growing hope. The late February morning brought an unexpected warmth that turned the pristine snow into a treacherous mix of slush and mud. Water dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves, creating small rivulets that carved paths through the dirty snow. The early thaw had caught everyone by surprise. Hannah stood at the window, watching Jonas work on the fence line where winter storms had loosened several posts. His broad shoulders moved rhythmically as he tamped down the earth around a particularly wobbly rail. Toma sat nearby on an overturned bucket, handing Jonas tools when asked and practicing his English by naming each one. The peaceful scene shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Hannah's heart sank as Deputy Rourke's bay gelding splashed through the muddy yard. The deputy's face was set in grim lines that made her stomach clench with worry. Jonas straightened slowly, positioning himself between Toma and the approaching lawman. His shoulders tensed as Rourke dismounted, but his voice remained steady. "Something we can help you with, deputy?" Rourke's boots made sucking sounds in the mud as he approached. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, holding it out to Jonas. "Got some serious matters to discuss, Holly. Army business." Hannah hurried outside, her boots slipping on the wet steps. She reached Jonas's side just as he opened the document, watching his face grow hard as stone as he read. "These charges are false," Jonas said quietly, his jaw tight. "I served honorably. Got my discharge papers to prove it. Papers can be forged," Rourke drawled, hooking his thumbs in his gum belt. "Army claims you deserted during the Apache campaign. If that's true, you weren't legally free to marry." His eyes slid to Hannah. "Which means this marriage ain't valid. Interesting timing, considering the property situation." Hannah's hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous." "Jonas is an honest man." "Maybe so." Rourke's attention shifted to Toma, who had shrunk back against the fence. "But that ain't all I'm here for. Boy's been reported as a vagrant. Railroad's got rules about unattached Indians near the lines. He'll need to come with me." "No." Hannah stepped forward. "Toma's under our care. He's just a child." "Law's the law, ma'am. Railroad work camp's got other Indian boys. They'll look after him proper." Before anyone could move, Rourke strode over and grabbed Toma's arm. The boy tried to pull away, but the deputy easily lifted him onto his horse. Hannah rushed forward, but Jonas caught her arm, holding her back as Toma called out in frightened Navajo. "You can't do this." Hannah fought against Jonas's grip. "He's not a vagrant. He's family." "Ain't legal family," Rourke said, mounting behind Toma. "Best sort this out quick, Holly. Army patrol's due through next week. They'll be mighty interested in these desertion charges." He gathered his reins. "Course, might be willing to lose that paperwork if certain property matters get settled proper-like." They watched helplessly as Rourke rode away, Toma's small figure rigid with fear on the saddle before him. The boy's dark eyes stayed fixed on them until horse and riders disappeared around the bend. Hannah whirled on Jonas, tears of rage and fear streaming down her face. "We have to go after them. We can't let them take him." Jonas's face was carved from granite, but his hands were gentle as they gripped her shoulders. "Hannah," his voice was rough. "If that army patrol comes and finds me here, they'll arrest me. Won't matter if the charges are false. They'll hold me till it's sorted out. Could take months." He swallowed hard. "Long enough for Finch to push through his claim on your land." "Our land," Hannah corrected fiercely. "You're my husband." Not if these charges stick. Jonas released her and walked to the fence, staring in the direction Rourke had taken. This was planned. They're using Toma to draw us out, force our hand. His big hands clenched on the rail. I should go before that patrol arrives. Give you a chance to claim the marriage was a mistake, but you didn't know about the desertion. Might save the property. Hannah grabbed his arm, forcing him to look. At her. No, I won't lose you both. There has to be another way. Jonas's eyes held such pain it made her breath catch. I won't let them take everything from you, Hannah. Not your home, not your dignity. He covered her hand with his. But I can't protect you if I'm in chains. And right now, I can't even protect that boy who trusted us. The weight of it all pressed down on Hannah's chest like iron bands. In the space of minutes, their carefully built world had cracked apart. The muddy yard where Toma had played just moments ago stood empty. The half-finished fence marked where Jonas had worked each day, making their home stronger. Now everything teetered on the edge of ruin. Jonas's next words came so quietly she barely heard them. I have to leave, Hannah, before they come for me. She stared at him, this man who had arrived on her doorstep in a snowstorm and slowly built a place in her heart, who had shown her what it meant to have a partner, not just a protector, who had helped her create something precious and rare, a true family, bound by choice rather than blood. The thought of losing it all made her want to scream at the injustice, but she forced herself to think past the pain, past the fear. There had to be a way through this darkness. There had to be. But for now, all she could do was watch as Jonas turned toward the barn. His shoulders bowed under the weight of what was coming. The morning sun caught the moisture dripping from the eaves, each drop falling like tears onto the muddy ground below. The lamp cast wavering shadows across the cabin walls as Hannah paced the worn floorboards. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind reminded her of Toma's empty pallet by the hearth. Jonas sat at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle, though his eyes followed her movement. I won't let you leave, Hannah said finally, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. She stopped pacing and faced him squarely. We're not abandoning Toma, and I'm not letting you run from false charges. Jonas set down his cleaning cloth with careful precision. Hannah, you don't understand what we're up against. These men, no. She crossed to the table and planted both palms on its scarred surface, leaning toward him. You don't understand. I've already lost one husband to circumstances I couldn't control. I watched him walk away that morning, never to return. I won't do it again. The lamplight caught the glint of moisture in her eyes, but her chin remained high. Jonas's shoulders tensed as he looked away. The things I did in the army, ... He traced a finger along the rifle's stock. Some were necessary. Some I'm not proud of. But that last order, his voice roughened. They wanted us to raid a peaceful camp. Women, children. I couldn't do it. Walking away was right, but it marked me, made enemies. Then face them, Hannah insisted. Show them the truth. Running only makes you look guilty. Jonas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. And what happens to you if I fail? To your land? Our land, she corrected, moving around the table to stand before him. Just like he's our boy. Not some vagrant to be worked to death in a railroad camp. She reached up, pressing her palm against his chest where his heart beat. Steady and strong. You taught me to use snowshoes so I wouldn't fall. Taught Toma to stack wood proper so it would dry right. That's not a man who runs from what matters. The muscle in Jonas's jaw worked as he covered her hand with his own. I thought leaving would protect you both. Protection isn't worth much without hope behind it. Hannah's fingers curled into his shirt. We'll ride into town tomorrow. Face whatever comes together. For a long moment, Jonas stood silent. Then his other hand came up to cup her cheek. thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You shame me with your courage, Hannah Cole." "Holly," she corrected softly. "Hannah Holly now. And don't you forget it." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." They spent the next hour preparing for the morning ride. Hannah packed jerky and coffee in her saddlebags, while Jonas gathered his discharge papers and other documents that might help their case. They worked in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the ease of practice. When Hannah finally lay down, she left her door open. After a moment, she heard Jonas settle his bedroll near the hearth, in the spot where Toma usually slept. The familiar sound of his breathing eventually lulled her to sleep. Dawn came sharp and cold, frost glittering on every surface. Their breath fogged in the early light as they saddled their mounts. Jonas's steady mule and Hannah's mar, Molly. Hannah tucked an extra blanket into her saddlebags, remembering how Toma always seemed to feel the cold more deeply than they did. The ride into town stretched long and tense. Neither spoke much, saving their energy against the biting wind that cut through their coats. The sun climbed higher, but brought little warmth. Hannah's thoughts kept returning to Toma, wondering if he was warm enough, if anyone had thought to feed him breakfast. Jonas rode slightly ahead, his broad back a shield against the wind. Occasionally he would turn in his saddle to check on her, his eyes concerned but steady. Each time, she straightened her spine and nodded. She wouldn't let him see her falter. Now, by midday, the church steeple finally rose above the trees, its weathered cross standing stark against the winter sky. Hannah's hands tightened on her reins. Somewhere in that town, Toma waited. Somewhere in those streets, men plotted to take everything they'd built together. As they approached the outskirts, Jonas reined his mule closer to Molly. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "know that these past weeks have meant more than I can say." Hannah reached across the space between them to grip his arm. "Save your goodbyes, Jonas Holly. We've got work to do." He covered her hand with his rough fingers, warm despite the cold. Together, they rode toward whatever waited in town, the church steeple pointing the way forward like a beacon of hope against the pale winter sky. Reverend Avery's small office smelled of wood smoke and old books. He listened intently as Jonas explained the situation, his weathered hands folded on the desk. "Fort Lyon, you say?" The Reverend's eyes brightened. "Preacher Daniel Morton served there. He wrote me about a scout who stood against injustice." He rose, reaching for his coat. "The telegraph office opens early. We might catch Morton before his circuit ride." While the Reverend composed the telegram, Hannah and Jonas searched the freight yard. They found Toma huddled in a makeshift pen, his small frame shivering despite the wool blanket someone had thrown over him. His eyes lit up when he saw them. A Deputy Rourke stepped between them, hand resting on his gumbelt. "Boys bound for the work camp," Rourke drawled. "Unless you've got papers saying different." Jonas's hands clenched at his sides. Hannah touched his arm gently, feeling the tension in his muscles. "We'll get those papers," she said firmly, meeting Rourke's smirk with steady eyes. They spent the afternoon in the church's back room, where a pot-bellied stove fought against the chill. Hannah cupped a tin mug of weak coffee between her palms, watching Jonas pace. Every hour, they checked the telegraph office. No reply. The sun was setting when the telegraph clerk burst through the church door, waving a yellow paper. "Message from Fort Lyon." He called out. Reverend Avery read the telegram aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. Preacher Morton confirmed everything. Jonas's honorable service, his refusal of an unlawful order to attack peaceful Apaches, his clean discharge. "That settles the desertion charge," the Reverend said, satisfaction clear in his tone. "No one can claim your marriage is void now, Mrs. Holly." Jonas stood straighter, as if a weight had lifted from his shoulders. Hannah squeezed his hand, relief making her knees weak. One battle won. Now they could focus on bringing Toma home. The sheriff's office was cramped and stuffy, lit by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows on the wooden walls. Hannah stood close to Jonas as he faced Deputy Rourke and Samuel Finch. Across the sheriff's desk, Reverend Avery's tall frame filled the doorway, his presence keeping tempers in check. Jonas held up the telegram, his voice steady as he read Morton's words. Holly served with distinction. Refused unlawful orders targeting. Peaceful Apache settlement. Honorably discharged with commendation. The smirk slipped from Rourke's face like melting snow. Finch tugged at his silk cravat, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening chill. Furthermore, Jonas continued, laying out papers on the desk. These land documents show clear signs of forgery. The filing dates don't match territorial records. Now see here, Finch blustered, his polished manner cracking. Those are legitimate railroad claims. The sheriff leaned forward, squinting at the papers through his spectacles. These seals are wrong, he muttered. And these signatures. He looked up sharply. This is fraud under the new territorial statutes. Finch. Color drained from the land agent's face as the sheriff pulled out his handcuffs. Rourke stepped back, suddenly finding the floor fascinating. Deputy, the sheriff ordered, release the boy. Rourke's jaw clenched, but he stomped out and returned with Toma. The moment the deputy's hand left his shoulder, Toma darted across the room and buried his face in Hannah's skirt, his small fingers clutching the fabric. They stepped out into the muddy street, where fresh lamplight spilled from shop windows. The snow had stopped, leaving the air clean and sharp. Hannah held Toma close while Jonas spoke quietly with Reverend Avery. Behind them, through the office window, they could see Finch sitting dejectedly in handcuffs. Reverend Avery's wife had laid out quilts in the small parlor, making beds near the warm stove. The parsonage smelled of beeswax candles and fresh-baked bread. Around the simple supper table, steam rose from bowls of bean soup, while Toma hungrily devoured 2 thick slices of bread slathered with butter. The Lord's work often comes through, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, Reverend Avery said, breaking the evening's quiet. His weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. It takes courage to stand against injustice, but there's grace in that standing and healing too. Hannah watched Jonas as the Reverend spoke. The mountain man's usual stern expression had softened, something shifting behind his eyes. When he caught her looking, the corner of his mouth lifted in a slight smile that made her heart flutter. Morning came crisp and bright. They set out early. Toma perched securely on Jonas's mule between their horses. The boy's face was turned up to the warming sun, his small hands wrapped in the mule's coarse mane. The trail home wound through stands of pine where patches of bare ground showed through melting snow. Hannah breathed in deeply. There was a hint of spring in the air, that subtle sweetness of thawing earth and awakening things. When the cabin came into view, Hannah noticed the porch first. The boards were swept clean of snow, as if winter itself had begun retreating. Jonas dismounted first, helping Toma down before untying his gear. Standing there in the yard, watching Toma run to check on the chickens, Jonas's voice was quiet but certain. Feels like we made it. Hannah looked at him, this man who had arrived at her door in a snowstorm and somehow become her anchor. Yes, she said softly. I reckon we did. The April sunshine warmed Hannah's shoulders as she knelt in the freshly turned soil of her garden. Tender green shoots pushed through the dark earth, promises of summer vegetables to come. She patted the dirt around a fragile tomato seedling, remembering how different everything had felt just months ago. Near the barn, Jonas and Toma sat on upturned crates, paintbrushes in hand. The little birdhouse they built together was coming, alive with bright colors. Jonas guided Toma's small hand, showing him how to make neat strokes along the wooden edges. "Steady now," Jonas said, his voice gentle. "Like that. You're doing fine." Hannah smiled, watching them. The boy had flourished these past weeks, his eyes bright with trust instead of fear. She brushed dirt from her apron and stood, stretching her back. Inside the cabin, the new cradle caught the afternoon light. Jonas had finished it yesterday, sanding the wood smooth as silk. Hannah ran her fingers along the curved edge, remembering his shy expression when he'd carried it in. He'd set it in the sunniest corner of the room, right where a baby could watch cottonwood leaves dancing through the window. After supper, they settled on the porch steps. The evening air was soft with spring, carrying the sound of snowmelt trickling into puddles across the yard. Thomas sat nearby, humming a tune while he whittled a stick with his new pocket knife. Jonas's calloused hand found Hannah's, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "You know," he said with a quiet laugh, "I was told you needed a husband." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "But I think we both needed a home." Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and leather. Through the cabin window, lamplight spilled golden across the floor, warming the shadows. Spring had come at last to the land and to their hearts. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.